Well, good morning, everybody. There's plenty to celebrate this week. Mark passed an exam, I heard this week, an exam which he'd already failed 5 times in the past, and he passed it this time, having used the Genius Material System. So many, many congratulations, Mark. That must feel really good. I know you've got some more exams to go, but I know that you know now you're on your way and you know how to get those exams passed. So good for you. Congratulations. And the other thing is, it's my birthday today, so happy birthday to me. And I intend to have a lovely day. So I don't know where you are, but it's nice and sunny here, so I hope it stays that way. So happy birthday to me. Now, today, thank you very much, Matthew. Thanks very much. Back to basics today. I want us to remind ourselves of the fundamentals of note making, to make sure we're doing everything we can do to help ourselves. And we're going to have a look at why the visual system, using our visual skills, is quick and easy and very, very effective. Okay, so you already know that human beings are hardwired to forget. We're meant to forget. That's why we forget so easily. That's why we forget 80% of what we've learnt within a couple of weeks, usually. Okay, now then, you're just going to have to forgive me while I get through this next slide because I'd forgotten that was in there. You don't need to know all that, do you? Or maybe you would be interested. I taught for 20 years, and in the last 10 or so years, I stopped teaching in schools and I concentrated on helping individuals use their brains more effectively. And I've got a lot of training and experience under my belt now, and I help people with emotional and behavioural issues. And also, I'm very good with difficult medical conditions that doctors can't help with. And I've discovered that I've been attracting teenagers, quite a lot of teenagers. I guess because the word got round that I used to teach, and people must have trusted me with their kids. And the thing is that many of these teenagers were turning up because they were having difficult medical conditions and were falling behind at school. I mean, nasty things like anorexia and ME. I mean, really, really tricky stuff. And I've been helping them get rid of the difficult medical condition and then training them up how to organise themselves, how to revise so they can catch up with the work they've missed and then steam ahead to get the results they need to go to their first choice universities. And that's been going very well. 18 months ago, a colleague of mine who is an IFA mentioned the deadline that you've got at the end of 2012, and that some of the things that I was teaching these teenagers would be very well received by the IFAs. Of course, many of whom haven't been in the classroom for decades and have never been taught how to revise in the first place. So that's how Genius Material was born. Now, as you know, we are physiologically pretty much the same as we were 10,000 years ago. And there are parts of our brains controlling different things on our behalf. Some of it's conscious, the newer part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's the bit that we do all our planning and really thinking with. But most of the brain, the older part of the brain, just operates automatically on our behalf, regulates the heartbeat, breathing, those sorts of things, makes your hair and nails grow. All that happens automatically. You don't have to stop and think about it. And using the word unconscious mind, it's a metaphor for the parts of the brain that operate automatically. And really, it's there in all animals to help us make sense of the world and to keep us safe. That's the automatic behaviour that you see animals using. So, for example, you'll see a cat or a dog suddenly sit up and take interest in something. And as soon as they've decided that it's safe out there, they just, relax again and go back to sleep. So all of that is happening automatically, and there's much of our brain doing that for us too. Basically, those parts of the brain are to help us to survive life. Now, when it comes to forgetting stuff, that's a very useful skill. You can probably imagine that all those years ago, it was vital to our survival that people would forget where they saw the herd of deer 2-3 weeks ago, but remember where they saw it yesterday afternoon or this morning. Vital to survival. And it's still a useful skill for us now. How much better off are you forgetting where the car keys were 3 months ago, but remembering where they were 5 minutes ago? But that's all very well, but it's no good to us when it comes to doing our revision, when you need to retain the information you're learning. Oh, and you know that you forget 80% within 2 weeks unless you take a different course of action. Did you know that 71% of people aren't revising for their brain's preferred learning type? Because we all process, store and retrieve information differently. And if you put those two things together, if most of us forget most of what we've learnt within a relatively short amount of time, and we're not even revising the best way for us in the first place, it's no great surprise that so many people are failing exams. So let's have a look again today at the principles of learning and of making notes and ways of keeping them in your head. Because you've probably already discovered that once you know how to revise, you won't only pass your exams first time, but you actually enjoy the revision process. And that's bound to make you more confident and feel better about yourself. And I know already that some of you are considering going on to chartered status because now the exams are an opportunity to show what you know, rather than a feeling that they're there to trip you up. Now, you've seen this before. The pink part, of course, is forgetting most of what you've learnt very, very quickly. So you tend to forget around about 80% within a couple of weeks, and you continue to forget. And look, most of it happens within the first day. That's why it's so vitally important for you to test yourself the day after, before it's too late. And if you follow the Genius system, you're more likely to end up in that blue region up there, remembering round about 80%. But ongoingly, look at that, 6 months later. Much, much better. The 3 keys to learning are absolutely vital. You'd hear me batting on about them a lot of the time. There's a good reason for that. First of all, to remember anything, to compensate for the fact that your brain will tend to forget stuff, first of all, you need to spend enough time with the information in the first place. You need to make brain-friendly notes. And you need to go back to the information on a regular basis. That's it. That's what you need to know. So, you need to spend enough time with the information for your brain to make a pattern of it and send it to your long-term memory. You need to make brain-friendly notes. Best if you can use both sides of the brain, more of your brain. And if you can use your brain in the best way that you already use your brain, you're going to find it a lot easier. And of course, the learning cycle, you need to revisit what you've learnt. And when you revisit it, it's just a simple question of just testing yourself quickly according to the learning cycle. Now, why is it necessary to make all this fuss? That's why your brain already receives 10,000 or so bits of information every second. Can you believe that? That's how much information we're bombarded with. Needless to say, your brain is filtering that information all the time, automatically. For example, if you're crossing the road, you're going to be filtering out the information that's not important right now and focusing on what is important. And that's going to happen automatically. So, for example, you're going to continue to pay attention to the traffic, how fast it's moving, where it is in relation to you, how fast you're crossing the road, all those sorts of things, rather than the colour of the polka dots on the skirt of the woman walking along with a dog on the other side of the road. You might have noticed that another time, but right now you're going to be focusing automatically on that which is going to keep you alive. That's all very well. But your automatic unconscious mind is automatically filtering out stuff that's not essential to your survival, and revision doesn't come into that category. I know it's important, but it's not important to your survival. So we have to do stuff to compensate. And how do you do that? You spend enough time with the information in the first place, you make brain-friendly notes, and you go back to the information on a regular basis. Now, you know that human beings have a lot in common with each other. On the other hand, we also have variations in the way that we process, store and retrieve information. And where you're going to start winning is when you discover what your preferences are, because it's going to make your revision faster and easier. And as you know, by doing the Genius Questionnaire, which has automatically profiled you for your brain and learning type, your eBook tells you exactly how to revise to do that best for you using your learning preferences. And you've already got that book and you've already been through that and starting to put that information into use. But I just thought it might be interesting for you to just look at the sorts of things that other people have got. Just see if you recognise yourself in these examples. So, for example, we've got a continuum between extroversion and introversion. You're not just extrovert or just introvert. And by the way, extroversion doesn't mean that you spend your time dancing on the tables on a Friday night, although it is Friday and it is my birthday, so hey, who knows? Extroversion and introversion is all to do with how you prefer to spend your downtime. So, for example, if you've had a really hectic, busy day, for example, if I've had a day of clients or I've gone off and done a workshop somewhere, then how you tend to spend your time at the end of that day gives you a bit of a clue on this one. So some people look outside of themselves, extroversion, and want to spend time with other people. Some people look inwards and prefer to spend time alone. So that's what it really means. If you tend to be the extroversion type, and of course, as I say, it's in a continuum, you're not just black and white, one thing or the other. But if under some circumstances you tend to want to spend time with other people, because it is circumstance dependent, then when it comes to revising, you might really do very well finding opportunities to explain your notes to somebody else. You'd probably do well to get yourself into discussions about it, help you to explore the thing that you're learning. And you'd probably do well to get yourself a study buddy, somebody to work with. Now, on the other hand, that wouldn't work so well, perhaps, for somebody who tends to introversion. They'd be better off just spending some quiet time reflecting on what they've just learnt, maybe reading about it, or listening to tapes, oh gosh, I'm showing my age, aren't I? Audios, I should say, audio tracks about it, or maybe listening to somebody else talking about it. See, those are the sorts of differences there are, and we get to know how we are, and we assume that other people are the same, and that really isn't the case. Here's another example. Some people are highly kinesthetic. Now, we all started highly kinesthetic as kids. We learn by copying. If you're at all kinesthetic, then you're somebody who learns well by copying. Perhaps you're a good dancer. Perhaps you enjoy Tai Chi and sports. Somebody who can make stuff practical is very often quite kinesthetic, and we are all kinesthetic to some degree. And as I said earlier, we all started off this way. We all learnt to speak by copying patterns and words that we hear around us. We learnt to walk by copying other people. We learnt to tie shoelaces by copying. And we did a lot of stuff in primary school by getting stuff out and holding it and touching it and putting things inside other things and shifting things around and seeing how they compared with other stuff. And as you get to secondary school, it's much better these days, but it tends towards sitting in rows and looking towards the teacher at the front. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing there, but it's far more hands-on at primary school than it still is in secondary school. And by the time you go off to university, you really are sitting in rows very often and attending to the lecturer. When it comes to work, you've probably got yourself a desk and maybe even a cubicle in an open plan office. You sit very still and you stare at a screen, perhaps. So if you're quite kinesthetic, there are techniques that you can use. I've got there mapping and storyboarding. So some of those techniques would go down very well with you if you're somebody who learns by copying. Do you remember the generation game? Bruce Forsyth's, wasn't it? Gosh, we're going back a bit now. The last game of all was two couples, and they had to make something. And it was something they had to make by copying an expert. And one in particular I remember was somebody making pizza dough, and every time they threw this disc up in the air, it got wider and wider and thinner. It looked dead easy. But of course, when the couples had a go at it, it was complete mayhem. Very, very difficult to copy. And they do things like origami, paper folding, and that sort of thing. And it was a test of how well they learnt by copying just the once. If you're good at doing stuff, then you're probably quite kinesthetic. Now, some people are quite digital, and they don't understand something unless they can make sense of what they're doing. Now, remember, I also said that we are all kinesthetic to a certain extent. We're all digital to a certain extent. We are all of these things, introvert, extrovert, in different circumstances. So it's true to say that the more you can make sense of what you're doing, the more easily you remember it. Here's an example. I never used to learn formulae at school. That sounds like a recipe for disaster, but it wasn't, because what I used to do, this part just came naturally to me. There's plenty I couldn't manage so well, but this part just was natural to me. And that is, I just used to understand where the different elements of the formula came from in the first place. So if we had to work out, for example, how many miles a ship had travelled in so many hours doing so many knots or whatever, I used to pull all the bits of the equation together. I used to put the equation together first, and then I used to work the answer out. So depending on what the question was in the exam for maths or physics, I used to create the appropriate formula and then work the answer out. And that worked for me. And it was because I could see the logical relationships between all the different elements, and one thing triggered the next thing for me. So it's true to say that the more you can really get under the skin of what you're learning, the easier it will be to retain it. Some people are good with their ears. If you're somebody who learns well by listening, then you're probably quite auditory. Now, I've mentioned before that my husband is rubbish at following verbal instructions, but I tell you what, his auditory memory is astonishing. And if I accuse him of not listening to me, he can actually come to and repeat word for word exactly what I've just said, to my annoyance, of course, because he wasn't listening the first time round, but he remembered what I said. Now, that is exceptional. I'm not sure how useful it is, but it is exceptional. And most of us don't fall into that category. But if you, generally speaking, get on well by listening to stuff, if you're quite musical, then if you're a good listener and other people tell you so, then you might do well in your revision by reading your notes out loud. Because that way, of course, you're not only saying it, but you're hearing it as well. You might do well by recording your notes and listening back to your notes. You might do well to turn some of your notes into rhymes and silly songs. That will help to lodge it in your mind. If you're somebody who remembers lyrics well, for example, then this might work very well for you. But above all else, avoid noisy distractions. I will be the person, I'm quite auditory, I will be the person in a workshop, in a lecture, in a meeting, where there's a noise outside in the corridor and the door has been left open. I will be the one to get up and go and shut the door quietly, because that noise is just making it really difficult for me to concentrate on what's going on in front of me in my room. So look out for noisy distractions. Finally, I want to talk today about the visual system, because it's the quickest system that you can use for revision. Did you know that 50% of the brain's pathways are connected to vision? Isn't that astonishing? 40% of our nerve fibres are connected to the brain. That are connected to the brain, are linked to our vision, our visual system. Isn't that amazing? And you know, eye tracking, when doctors look at a person's eyes, how the eyes move, is a near perfect gauge of if their brain is functioning correctly. So, for example, if someone's had a nasty knock to the head, they will use the way that the eyes move to ascertain whether the person's okay or whether they need further assistance. And did you know that our eyes are never still? They are moving in tiny little movements all the time. They're called saccadic movements. So what I'm trying to say is our visual system is very closely linked to the brain. Of course, everything's linked to the brain, otherwise we wouldn't exist, would we? But it's a very strong link there. And here's the kicker. I mentioned all that information entering the brain every second. 90% of that information is visual. What do you make of that? And the brain processes visual information 60,000 times faster than text. That gives us something to think about. 65% of the population are probably straightforward visual learners. But for all of us, we are all visual, and visual aids improve learning, it's reckoned, 4 times over. So that should inform us when it comes to making our notes. And we're not just talking about that 65%, we're talking about you. You are sufficiently visual for what we're talking about. Some people say, I can't see it, I can't remember. Whatever visual systems you are using to watch this program is plenty for what we're talking about. So let's have a look at the quickest, most effective way to revise when you're short of time, which I know you are. As I say, we've got lots in common. We've all got sufficient visual skills. We might even enjoy what we're doing when we find we can save ourselves time. Here we go. Making notes. Now this is key number 2, making brain-friendly notes. You've got to compensate for all that competing information and get your unconscious mind's attention. The automatic part of your mind that's constantly filtering out information. You've got to get its attention. How do you do that? Well, divide everything up into manageable chunks. Small chunks of information and small chunks of time. Because we already know that we automatically easily remember the beginnings and ends of chunks. Anything can be learnt if you divide it up into small enough chunks. So small chunks of time during the day and small chunks of information, which is why we've got the rule of 7. You know that you only want a few bits of information on the page. You can have as many pages as you want, but you only want a few bits of information. So you can close your eyes and still see the pattern of words, the spaces, the actual words themselves, any pictures you've got on there, colours you've got on there, visual system, you see. So look at this. Which is easier to remember, this or this? Now I haven't asked you to read or understand any of it, but just look again. Lots and lots and lots of words all set out horizontally in sentences, or a few words set out in patterns. Do you see what I'm getting at? We recognise the patterns. That's using our visual system. Another thing we can bear in mind is the serial position. We've mentioned small chunks of information, and we're very good at remembering the beginnings and ends. So don't underestimate this, because that becomes easier to remember. So you can put the harder stuff at the beginnings and the ends of chunks of information. That's the point, really. Not only are you better off using small chunks of information, small chunks of time, but if you look at the hard stuff at the beginning of the session or the end of the session, or in your notes put the hard stuff at the beginning of the chunk or the end of the chunk, then you're automatically more likely to remember it, or find it easier to remember, because of the fact that we tend to remember anyway the beginnings and ends. So go for short bursts of time. Now, the von Restorff effect. We tend to notice things that stand out, things that are different. So, for example, I don't know where you are right now, but if somebody just crept into the back of the room, grabbed something, somebody you know, somebody familiar to you, quietly came to the back of the room, grabbed something and left, you'd probably not give it 2 seconds of your time because you're busy watching this. However, if Father Christmas turned up and did the same thing, you'd probably get distracted, because that would be a bit different and unexpected. So think about that when you're doing your notes. You can make something different by making it bigger. You can make something different by making it a different colour. You can make it peculiar, or rude, or funny. How about cutting out a magazine photo and writing on that? Depending on what the photo is, it might help you to remember it. Do something silly. Warp or distort what you're doing. Something to make it stand out. Now, you already know about the Zeigarnik effect as well, that when we're interrupted, we tend to remember something because the brain desperately wants to complete. It wants to make sense of stuff. It wants to complete the circle. It will tend to remember it anyway. There's evidence of this when you do a crossword. You might have nearly finished the crossword and you've got to go, you've run out of time, but you stress over it, you just cannot leave it alone. Your brain is just desperately trying to remember and work out and just get the last couple of clues. So the point is that if you get interrupted in your revision, don't panic, because you might well find that your brain will compensate anyway, because that's what your brains are hardwired to do, to make sense of stuff. Don't underestimate the power of recitation, talking out loud. You don't want to get yourself arrested, but on the other hand, if you get the opportunity to talk to yourself, then that's very good for you. As I say, we're all auditory to a certain extent. Our brains are hardwired to pay attention when you say things out loud. So get involved in what you're doing. Say stuff out loud. Act it out where you can. It might be quite tricky with some of the dry information you're dealing with, but nevertheless, ultimately you're dealing with people. So you could act out what you're learning, how it's relevant to actual clients and people, how you would tell them about it. Move. Act it out if you can. Get interested in what you're doing, because then your brain will go, oh, right, okay, this is interesting. And you know what it's like. Anything that's interesting, you're already there, aren't you? You don't have to get motivated to go and do something that you're already fascinated by. You're already doing it. So you'll want to spend about 20% reading, for example, your course manual, and a full 80% doing stuff with it. Actively manipulating the notes, creating notes, moving. Do you see what I'm getting at? That some people make the mistake of just reading and rereading the course manual. That sends the brain to sleep, so you know not to do that. You only want to spend a fifth of your time doing that, and the rest of your time doing something actively with the information. Keywords. As we looked at those two examples earlier on, if you just go for the bare bones of the content, just the odd word here and there, the important words, then it's easier to remember the patterns on the page. So just go for the keywords only. And when you've remembered those sort of parrot fashion, or rather visually, by closing your eyes and still seeing the words in your mind's eye, then each word will trigger the recall of the next. Your brain will, as I've mentioned, will make sense, will fill in the gaps, will complete the circle, will recall the meaning of the words in relation to each other. Might take a bit of leap of faith here, I appreciate that. And when I was a kid, I remember doing, what was it now, I think it was a biology A-level. I distinctly remember sitting down with a piece of A4 paper, lined of course, because they didn't know any better in those days. And we are talking about a long time ago, remember. And getting the idea from somewhere that I was supposed to make notes. So I had got that idea, and I must have interpreted that as just the odd word here and there. So I was almost on the right lines. But before I got to the bottom of the first side of paper, I was writing nearly everything out for fear of missing something important. It takes a leap of faith not to do that, but I'm talking about what works and what doesn't work. So keywords only. And make sure that each idea is represented by a keyword. Don't scrimp, don't just put the odd word down and leave out half the information. Make sure that each bit of information is represented there somewhere. And you're looking for only 10% of your course manual, that's all. It's a very small percentage, because that will trigger the other 90%. So you're only looking to work with about 10%. That will trigger the other 90% when it comes to putting it all together and making it work. And as you're writing down your keywords, when you're manipulating them, put them into a sequence so there's a logical progression from the beginning to the end, so that it does automatically trigger the next part. And if absolutely necessary, rewrite the whole lot. So here, for example, there are too many words. It looks neat. There's a heading. It's numbered. I've got brackets around the second two lines. It looks presented nicely, but there are too many words. This is the sort of thing that you're looking for. I don't expect you to understand what these notes are all about, because they're something that I've worked with. But I want you just to get the idea that it's a very few words that you're looking for. This is another good example. Very few words. And again, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know what it's all about. These are my notes and these make sense to me. And you see how I've got patterns there? Issue, shares, issue, shares, issue. Do you see? Now if I was going to spend a bit more time with those notes, I might put issue once and shares once and organise it into an even better pattern so that I'm not repeating words. But even there you can see that I've kept those similar words in columns. If you're going to use bullet points instead of numbers, then the same rules apply. The first word needs to be the key word. You need to have 7 or fewer bits of information on the page. Each idea needs to be represented by a bullet point, and 10% will still trigger 90%, so you're still looking for very few words. Put them in a logical sequence, and if necessary, if you see a better way of writing them or they're just not staying in your head, rewrite them. Now, that example I showed you earlier on, here they are with bullet points. I find that easier to see, and that's what I'm aiming for. And actually, if I had my time again, I would change those notes, as I say, so there's only one issue written there and only one shares written there. I'll have to think about it again because I can see how I can make even more of those patterns. Okay, so you want simplicity, few words. So here's a quick example. I'm aware that we're just over time, but very, very quickly. If you had this sentence in your course manual, that top bullet point is all I would write for it. This would be condensed to the second bullet point. You see how I've pulled out the information? This would be the third bullet point, and this would be the fourth. So that's what I'm trying to show you, that you really need to reduce it right down. Pictures, get creative, colour code them, do lots of drawing and doodles, because that's going to work. You see, I've colour coded these. The accident is red for blood, sickness, no prize for guessing what that's all about, and blue, redundancy. He's feeling pretty blue because he's been made redundant. What I'm trying to say to you is use pictures, use patterns and space, use colour, make things stand out, get your brain's attention. The more you do that, the easier you'll find this little lot to remember. And I know that's really important to you. And you already know not to use a lovely new exercise book for your revision notes because you'll be concentrating on keeping it neat and tidy and beautiful rather than doing what works. Instead, use blank A4 paper, not lines, because that will force you to write in a linear fashion, which is just using more of your logical left brain. You want to be using A4 paper where you can draw pictures and diagrams and arrows and shapes and use both sides of your brain. And then you can also, because it's loose paper, you can put it into the ring binder so that you know where it is when you need to find it to test yourself. And of course, as your notes change and develop, like we were saying earlier on, you might find ways of changing your notes to make them easier to remember. You can just chuck away easily your original version, which you won't be inclined to do if you've done it in a beautiful exercise book. So use loose paper and put it in a ring binder, because then you can more easily chuck things out. You know you've got to test yourself as well. You know how to do that. You've got to do that to keep it in your brain, because you saw from the charts that if you don't, you forget most of what you've done very, very quickly indeed. But by testing yourself the next day, you will keep that in your brain, especially if you test yourself a week later and then monthly until the exam. Okay, so if you've got any questions, why don't you give me a ring or email me immediately after, and I'll be here to answer your questions. Please send me your notes. Let me have a look at them, see if I can see any way of helping you to remember them more easily. But for the moment, that's it. I hope you have a really great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.